So I want to start with your career because you've been an OB-GYN for more than 30 years. And at the start of your career, you performed abortions and you no longer do. You're a person of faith now. We're going to get into all of that. But what was it that sort of led you into that practice early on?
Well, Billy, the first procedure that you learn as a doctor in training in the specialty of OB-GYN is the so-called D&C procedure. Perhaps the most common situation is being called to the emergency room. A woman is in the process of miscarrying, and because of the amount of bleeding, the best course of action would be to place a small plastic tube inside the uterus and to suction out the pregnancy tissue remaining so that her bleeding can stop. And so that procedure is something that is basic. Before you do any procedure as an OB-GYN doctor, that's the one you do. So you have the quote technical skill to do a D&C procedure, which is pretty much the same as you would how you would do an abortion, a first trimester abortion. Those were the days before there were medication abortions, and so back then, if a woman chose to have an abortion, she was going to have this D&C procedure. So, how I got into doing abortions is that being a young doctor, I moved to a new city. We bought a home, and it was primarily a financial decision in the sense that I wanted to work extra hours. And so it wasn't limited to doing abortions. I did surgery at night, doing hysterectomies and that sort of thing, and also working in the delivery room to deliver babies. But another aspect of my income enhancement, if you will, was to perform abortions in the evening clinics that we had in Sacramento.
Let me ask you about that because it's so interesting. Obviously, the lens through which we see everything, worldview, it changes everything. When you become a Christian, you see everything through a Christian lens. But when you go back to who you were before at the beginning of your career, were there any qualms? Was there anything that held you back? How did you look at abortion as an issue? Because you don't often get to talk to doctors who have performed them and who come from the perspective you do now. So what was sort of the way you viewed what you were doing at the time?
Well, it's obvious what we're doing, Billy, in the sense that before doing an abortion, you've got to do an ultrasound to accurately assess how far along this woman's pregnancy is. How big is her baby? Because if you're wrong and either she's not pregnant in the uterus or if she's too far along, bad things can happen. So you could lead to grave complications if you miss an ectopic pregnancy. You could go down a path where you're going to have unexpected bleeding and also run into a situation where your suction tubing isn't going to be able to complete the abortion. Then you would have to grab instruments that only a skilled abortionist would be able to use. But what I would say is that I viewed it as providing a service. Being an employee of a healthcare company, I said to myself, well, abortion's legal in this country. By law, our healthcare company has to provide abortion services. And it's got to be somebody in our specialty. And if I don't help out in this cause, then it's just going to fall on a couple of people. Because out of a department of perhaps 2 to 3 dozen doctors, there were only 2 or 3, so perhaps 1 out of a dozen that would be willing to perform abortions. And
Wow.
so I figured that I was going to be providing a service to women. And also, as a young doctor, I tried to justify this activity by saying, well, I can do it better by being more compassionate and not being so hardened, and making this difficult time as easy as possible for this woman. And one thing I don't think I've told you, Billy, is that looking back into my past, I have had two relationships where the women in my life had abortions. And so I thought it would be very hypocritical of me to say to somebody, oh, that's wrong. You
Mm.
shouldn't have an abortion, or I won't perform it. I just thought to myself, wait, I was involved in the same process. I have an understanding of the mindset, the fear, the rationale, the justification. And who am I to deny that same opportunity to another person?
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear because you mapped out a number of things there. I think one thing that's important to talk about, and I often remind people of this on other issues, it's not just abortion, but many of the people on the front lines of doing this sort of work, they believe they're helping people and they really believe,
Yes.
some of them, many of them, that they're doing the right thing. And you have to understand that if you're going to engage on these topics, right? Not understanding that doesn't give us the information we need to appropriately sort of engage on that. So it was helpful to hear you map both of those things out. Now, you obviously came to a point where being an atheist and doing abortions, it was no longer something you felt you can do. Can you take us through that life change? Because that's a pretty big transition to make.
Yes, it was a process of over a year or two. When I became a Christian, it was not an instantaneous connect the dots that, oh my gosh, people are infinitely valuable, made in God's image. He's known us before He formed us. He knitted us in our mother's womb. He has incredible plans for us. I really didn't understand initially that performing abortions was wrong. And how I became a Christian actually was a result of a tragic occurrence at work where I was responsible for the care of an 18-year-old mother who had just given birth the day before. Because of bleeding, she had an emergency hysterectomy that was performed by my colleagues. And as I assumed her care, I was physically present as they were completing her surgery. It was my responsibility to take care of her during the night as she recovered in the intensive care unit. And for reasons I still don't understand, she died. And
Wow.
that was a tragedy that is beyond words. And I remember every moment of that 6 hour period like it was yesterday. So I was devastated professionally and with full of pride because I was at the adolescence, if you will, of my career. Thought I was invincible, thought I was the greatest, thought I was awesome. And yet I had to face the reality that when it came time to really make a difference, I failed abysmally. So I was in the depths of my career right away.
Mm.
And then the second uh, issue came up was that my medical license was being reviewed by the state, and there was a potential for me to lose my license to practice medicine. And so that possibility led me to try to make a bargain with God. You see, because we had started our family, got a new home in a nice neighborhood, and if I'm not a doctor, I'm not making any money. And what's going to happen to us financially and socially, and how do I tell my friends and relatives what has happened?
Mm.
So, part of being in this new neighborhood where we currently live, we were surrounded by people of faith who attended this church that was starting out in the local high school. And we had been going to church, and I was just kind of a seeker, if you will. And it was during this time of crisis, trying to um, make sense of this incredible trial of losing potentially my license to be a doctor, of having failed miserably in the care of this young woman whose baby would never meet his mom, that I made a deal with God. And so I prayed that God, if you can get me through this mess, I'll be yours. And so that's how I became a Christian, Billy. And it sounds a little kind of funny, and it's hard for non-Christians to kind of like make sense of this. But one of the things that struck me to convince me that God was at work was my attorney had contacted me to let me know about the results of an oral examination, which I took in order to keep my license. And he provided me this wonderful news. He says, Dr. Wong, I've got great news for you. This whole thing's been settled. You passed your oral examination. I go, wonderful. Thank you so much for the wonderful news. And he asked me a question, which I thought was rather odd. He says to me, would you like to know what your score was? Uh, I was thinking to myself, hey, I passed. Why would I want to know the score? And he says to me, and I'm totally embarrassed by this. He says to me, well, the passing score was 70 and you got 71. And I thought to myself, two things. Number one, okay, God, your hand is in this. And number two is like, I really need to brush up on some stuff.
Mm.
So that's how I became a Christian. And as far as, okay, what's the next step of like getting to a point where I realize that performing abortions is wrong?
Right.
I mean, it kind of doesn't, you would think, dude, it starts with the 10 Commandments, like, thou shalt not kill.
But it's a
And
process for people, and I think that's like,
yeah,
not I think some people have these epiphany moments and they find God, and just, not to interrupt you, but I guess I
please.
will interrupt you for a moment because
Yeah,
I
that's
wanted to
fine.
ask, did you have any level of faith before that incident at all?
I would say no. No, I think that there could be, there might be. Nah, I don't think so.
Mostly essentially atheistic or at least agnostic.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, okay. All right.
totally.
And so then you jump into faith and God's refining you, and then you hit this point that you were about to tell us about.
Yeah, the point is, Billy, I'm sitting in the back row of the bleachers. It wasn't like I was this show up a half hour before church begins sort of guy. I would just, I would roll in after two things: after the worship and singing, and after the collection. I was one of those guys, sneaking in at the last minute, sitting in the back row, and I'm just like sort of listening to the message, but looking at the message notes. And in the bottom right corner of the message notes, I see that there is a request for pregnancy counselors to help at a pregnancy center. And I thought, that's very interesting. But I missed answering your question, and let me get to that. When I reached the point where I knew abortion, I couldn't continue anymore, was the only time our pastor has ever spoken about abortion. And this was during the time when the partial birth abortion ban was being discussed. And in a growing church, you have to be kind of politically correct and not really be too in your face. But it was an uncharacteristic description of that barbaric procedure that made me realize, my God, you are telling me that abortion is wrong. And within a short period of time, as I was walking back to the parking lot, I realized that what I was doing with my small plastic tube was no less barbaric than what people who were doing these partial birth abortions were doing. The body parts were smaller for me, but the act and the effect on that little baby was just as barbaric. And so it was at that point that I realized that abortion was no longer something that I should be participating in.
Wow. And how many abortions do you think, and I know it's probably a tough question to answer, but do you think you performed throughout your career?
I would have to guess in the hundreds. I don't know if I hit the 1,000 mark, but it was typically once a week, and I would perform anywhere from 6 to 8 abortions, and this was over a period of several years.
And how far along were these? Were they all first trimester?
Yes, all first trimesters. Yeah.
So it's interesting, that you went through this, you had this moment. Obviously, people around you, they had known you, they had watched you, people you worked with. What was the reaction to those who suddenly heard that this was something you were no longer going to be doing?
It was kind of a silence. There really wasn't much comment that I heard. I imagine that people may have spoken briefly, but if abortion is taboo in society to talk about, it's pretty much equally taboo, an off topic for us at work as well. We like to pretend that doesn't exist.
Yeah, and when you do talk about it, when people do talk about it, they use language that's sometimes deceptive. It's not really explaining what's going on. We sort of shield ourselves from the uncomfortableness of talking about what's going on actually in an abortion. I think a lot of people do that because it's interesting, even talking with pro-choice people who I know and love, and we disagree on the issue. It's interesting when you start to get into details how often they actually can't talk about it or don't want to talk about it, the actual details of what abortion
Yes,
is. That's
absolutely.
really interesting, right? And so I want to ask you this, and I want to get into Proposition 1 in California, which you've been very vocal speaking out against. We'll get into that in a moment. But one of the things that comes up, I've been covering this issue for a very long time. One of the arguments for late term abortion, right, which you were not participating in, but you know quite a bit about, was that, women will need this because if their life is in danger, they'll
Right.
need it. Now, a separate issue we won't even get into. If a child has some sort of ailment going on, that's a separate thing. But that argument of the woman's life, that a woman
Right.
might need an abortion at 8 months, let's say
Yeah.
gestation, is there any truth to that? Because it's said a lot.
Well, the quick answer, Billy, is it's categorically untrue. And it is illogical to say that after viability, so after 22 weeks, a baby could survive. And clearly, the survival rate at 23 weeks is not as good as at 35 weeks. Nonetheless, if a mother's life was in jeopardy after viability, then let's put out a hypothetical. A woman gets diagnosed with a cervical cancer at 23 weeks. In order to start treatment as soon as possible, we've got to end the pregnancy so that she can begin her treatment. Combination of surgery and radiation that is incompatible with pregnancy. Well, the process at 23 weeks would be to induce the labor, and lo and behold, you'd get a live baby born. So there is never any reason that you have to end a baby's life after viability for the welfare of a mother, because if the welfare of the mother is at stake, you would induce her labor.
And the baby at that point. And as you said, if it's 32 weeks, that might be different from 23 weeks in terms of chances of survival. But you would, at that point, that child has to come out either way, right?
Yes,
To
right.
put it in layman's terms, essentially. And so that argument is very interesting because I've actually been in conversations with people who would defend that, who are abortionists and who would say, oh, no, we have to do this. You just don't know. There's preeclampsia. They'll list out all of these things.
Yes.
And one of these doctors said to me once, it's actually always safer to perform an abortion than it is to go through birth for a woman. And I thought that was such an interesting statement. Now, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but that was sort of the argument for a late term abortion in these instances.
Well, I think we have to be cautious with studies, because I think studies are done by humans and there's always some sort of bias that's possible. And we have to look at the group of patients that we're talking about and how they're selected and how you get all the data and how you analyze everything. I don't believe, even if it's true, even if it's true that performing an abortion and in the third trimester is safer than giving birth. I doubt if that's true. But the question is, well, how dangerous is this? How dangerous is it to give birth? And I would have to say, probably not so much. I mean, it's sort of like saying, and this is a horrible analogy, but it goes to how we make our decisions. We know that driving in a car is more dangerous than flying in a plane. We're more likely to get killed in a car accident, right? That doesn't stop us from driving cars. And it is, maybe it's true. Let's grant our abortionist the fact that in his hands or her hands, because they're so skilled, that the delivery is going to be, quote, safer. But so what? Because giving birth is also safe.
Right. Right.
Right?
Yeah. And I think that it's just so fascinating to me. But I love how you explained that question of late term abortion in the mother's life, because that is one of the main arguments that is consistently brought up, in this discussion without any sort of evidence really of. I mean, I've gone back and forth with many of these doctors and I've asked, what is an example? Is there any example that you can point me toward where that had to happen with a healthy unborn baby? And nobody seems to be able to have an example of that, right? Despite it being an art.
Right. Exactly. There is not a good example, because the example of preeclampsia where blood pressure goes out of control, the treatment is not, oh my God, let's perform a C section, which would be the fastest way to deliver that baby. It's always take your time, induce your labor, and give it a couple of days. And you don't have to try to do that in a 1 hour procedure. My goodness.
So let's talk a little bit about what you've been vocal on recently, Proposition 1 in California. For those who don't live in California, and even for those who do and aren't aware of what's going on, what is Proposition 1?
Well, Proposition 1 is a constitutional amendment that says that abortion and contraceptives are a right for all Californians to have. The problem is that abortion is not defined in the same way as it has been defined in law. So, in law, the definition of abortion is up to the point of fetal viability. And I'll put that in quotes because getting back to your comment, Billy, about language and all this stuff. In my mind, the term fetus means a human life that is acceptably aborted. No, that's not a fetus. That's a baby in there. Okay, let's just
Right.
talk about
Right.
babies. But anyway, the problem with this Proposition 1 is that it would release any limits on fetal viability. And even proponents of the pro choice movement say there's a problem here because, as this proposition is written and has been submitted to the voters, there is no longer a limit of fetal viability, and it says abortion with no limits on viability. So potentially, this would mean that any woman could choose to end the life of her baby literally up until the time she goes into labor.
Wow. And right now, there are obviously, as you were saying, there are limits in California on this. So if this passes, and some of the polling is showing sweeping support for this in California, I mean, at least some of the polling that I have seen,
Oh, yes.
which which is, I'm sure, deeply concerning to you. You've made a decision to speak out on this. What has that been like for you when it comes to other doctors? How do people react when they see you being vocal against this?
It's fascinating because I'm now 4 years into my retirement. I don't see too many of my colleagues. Uh, just anecdotally, I would say that I've gotten a couple of electronic pats on the back. I met somebody on the tennis court a couple months ago who sent me out of the blue an email saying, "Hey, I saw your name attached to this proposition. Way to go!" So I think that there, the poll, I think there is more opposition to Proposition 1 in the public than we may realize.
Well, these issues are tricky when it comes to polling, right? I think one of the interesting things with abortion is that almost anybody on any side of the abortion issue can point to stats that show support for their position, right? I mean, you could say,
Yeah.
oh, well, most of the country didn't want Roe to go away. Well, that's a hard measure because, okay, people are upset about their rights. They might not fully understand what it even means. But you start asking questions like, hey, would you cap abortion at 3 months? And
Yes.
even the majority of pro-choice Americans would actually cap abortion at 3 months, right?
Right.
So it gets very interesting. So to your point, even knowing how people are going to vote on this, we can't fully know until the vote happens. Do you plan to continue being vocal on this until we know what's going to happen here?
Oh, absolutely. And there's no doubt that there will be legal challenges to this because, after all, in our society, we've got to fight for the rights of the unborn children.
What would you say, just as a final question here, to somebody who's watching this, listening to this, and they're struggling, with this issue? Maybe they're Christians, but maybe they've secretly had an abortion, or a friend or a loved one has, and they're just not sure what to make of the issue. They're not sure if they should allow God's standard to outweigh their own. What would you say to those people?
I would say trust your heart because our minds can come up with all sorts of justifications of why a woman should have an abortion. Her social situation isn't ideal, finances are tough, it's not the right time in her life. But I think as you just immerse yourself in this whole picture of a woman being pregnant and ask the question, what is the greatest source of joy in our lives? And aside from God, it's got to be our children. And the reason I point that out is that there is a very interesting lesson that God taught me. And this was before I had believed that abortion was wrong. But it's an experiment, if you will, Billy, that can never be replicated in a large scale. But there was a teenager who came to see us who was pregnant. Poor student, not a wealthy family, sophomore, 16 years old. So she wants to have an abortion and wants it as soon as possible. My schedule's booked. I referred her to my colleague. She has the procedure done. Boom. I asked my colleague, how did the procedure go with, let's call her Leslie? And he said everything went well. Fine. Well, Leslie came back to see me 4 months later because she hadn't had a period. And I could see that her abdomen was enlarging, did an ultrasound, and indeed, she had a baby who was now 26 weeks.
Wow.
So she and her mom were in tears, not because they were full of joy at that time, but because they were confronting a situation that they thought was taken care of months ago. But what I saw is a softening of the heart of both Leslie and her mom. And over the years, Billy, that I stayed in touch with them, which amounts to probably 7 years, that young lady turned into a wonderful mother who was so proud of her daughter as she grew up and did all the wonderful things that children learn to do. And in my mind, yeah, according to our society, she shouldn't have had the baby. Single, not married, hasn't even graduated from high school, not wealthy. What sort of life is that going to be? And, you know, I don't know how mothers make it work, but I've been fortunate enough to see that more often than not, almost 100% of the time, they do it.
They do. Well, I so appreciate you sharing your story, taking the time, talking about Proposition 1 and your opposition to it and what, is at stake in California there. There's a lot happening on this issue in the country right now, and we appreciate your voice today.
Thank you so much, Billy.